The welfare state, as it stands today, is often attributed to the Labour Party, but in fact, it's one of those rare cases in British politics where all three of the major parties, the Labour, the Liberals, and the Conservative Party, had a hand in the production of the welfare state. Now, the question that probably should be asked is whether or not the welfare state can survive into the 21st century, and I'm really not sure that is the case. I'm not sure it's possible. But we'll get to that. To start with, the creation of the welfare state is often attributed to the post-war Labour government and to Aneurin Bevan's stewardship of the NHS. But this is a simplification, and the foundations were laid by all three major political parties over several decades. There's the 1942 Beveridge Report, serving as the intellectual and the moral catalyst, and the welfare state that finally emerged in the 1940s was the product of cross-party evolution, wartime consensus, and a particular historical moment of national reconstruction. The Beveridge Report itself was commissioned by the coalition government during World War II and written by Sir William Beveridge, a liberal economist and a social reformer. And he outlined a comprehensive plan to tackle what he called the five giants: want, that's poverty; disease, that's ill health; ignorance, a lack of education; squalor, poor housing; and idleness, unemployment. And his central vision was a state system of national insurance, universal and not means tested, which would protect citizens from the cradle to the grave. Importantly, Beveridge was building on pre-war liberal reforms like Lloyd George's 1911 National Insurance Act and the early 20th century liberal welfare reforms. But the Conservatives, who had historically opposed welfare reforms during the war, the wartime leaders, especially Winston Churchill, recognised the need for national unity and post-war reconstruction. And Churchill gave Beveridge room to work, though he was more cautious about the implementation. The wartime coalition government introduced key measures. The 1944 Education Act, which was introduced by Butler, R.A. Butler, Rab Butler, which raised the school leaving age and aimed for universal secondary education. And the 1945 Family Allowances Act, passed under the coalition, which was the first universal child benefit. And while some conservatives feared creeping socialism, many accepted a limited welfare state as a bulwark against revolution and a means to stabilise the nation post-war. But it was when Labour won the landslide victory in 1945 that the Beveridge vision could find its chief architect in Aneurin Bevan, Labour's health minister. And under Bevan's direction, the National Health Service Act in 1946 created a free universal healthcare system. The National Insurance Act in 1946 consolidated benefits for unemployment, sickness, maternity, widowhood, and retirement. And the National Assistance Act in 1948 replaced the poor laws with safety net provision for those outside contributory schemes. Bevan's genius was not in dreaming up the welfare state, but in politically manoeuvring its creation, overcoming opposition from the British Medical Association and making compromises with middle-class professionals who were keeping the principle of universality and equity intact. So keeping that principle intact was meant juggling these issues of what particularly middle class professionals were prepared to accept. But in the end, it's something which went through with cross-party contributions. The Liberals provided the intellectual foundation and the policy design through Beveridge and earlier reformers. The Conservatives enabled early implementation of education and family policies and lent legitimacy to the consensus. And Labour, under Clement Attlee, carried through the most radical transformation, embedding the welfare state into the British political identity. It wasn't conjured up in 1945, it was forged in war, imagined in liberalism, tempered by conservative pragmatism, built by Labour hands, and Bevan gave it flesh, but Beveridge gave it soul. Its creation was one of those rare instances in British history where partisan traditions converged on a shared moral imperative, and that citizenship entails not only rights but protections. But the survival of the welfare state into the 20th century with the same ambitions, universal protection from cradle to grave, is precarious, but not at all impossible. It faces existential pressures from, simply the increase in our population, economics, globalization, and political will. But its underlying moral philosophy, what we have to do is to go back. I'm not sure whether we have to go back to 1945 or to go back to Beveridge, but we have to go back and to look at the impulses which created the welfare state in the first place, rather than accepting the format which was implemented in 1945. It's always a good idea to go back, to advance forward to the past, and then move on. So an ageing population means more claimants, fewer contributors. In Britain, the proportion of over 65s is rising sharply while birth rates fall and life expectancy increases. This places unprecedented pressure on pensions, social care, and healthcare spending. And the Beveridge model assumed a large working age population funding a smaller retired one. That arithmetic no longer holds. However, of course, with increased immigration, that arithmetic can be made to work again. Migrants coming into the country do not need education. They do not need to be, we don't need to deal with them as children. They come in ready to work. And enlisting that opportunity and encouraging them to pay tax and to work is a win-win situation. It deals with the demographic strain that we are experiencing, which puts such a stress on the welfare state. Or automation, that's AI, and the gig economy undermine the traditional full employment model that underpinned the contributory welfare system. Beveridge imagined a society where most people worked in secure, insurable jobs, and today's landscape is different. That means we simply need to adjust our education system. Many workers are self-employed on zero-hour contracts, and traditional employer-based benefits are eroding. This calls for a universal or unconditional scheme like universal basic income, and these are politically divisive and fiscally daunting, but not impossible. It's a matter of tailoring the system that we need to the needs of our time, but recognizing that technology doesn't necessarily disrupt the principles of the welfare state. The post-1979 shift towards neoliberal economics, especially under Mrs. Thatcher and Reagan, chipped away at the welfare ideal. And in the 21st century, global capital can move easily, but tax systems are national and porous. And governments are reluctant to raise taxes on wealth or corporations yet. But social expectations remain high, and public services have been hollowed out by austerity. This creates a crisis of legitimacy. Citizens pay taxes but feel services are diminished. Inequality grows and resentment festers. This is a political issue, and it needs to be addressed politically. And I don't think these issues are actually addressed by the various parties, any of the parties, in stages. It's all lumped up with a sort of emotional roar of I belong to the left or I belong to the right, or indeed I'm dismissive of the whole system. But to divide the problem up, Beveridge assumed that there a strong social solidarity, belief that we're all in this together in an era marked by individualism, identity politics, and often mistrust of the government. That consensus has frayed. And again, this is about political will and about restoring the not so much the belief in politicians. We don't have some sort of messianic potential in the House of Commons. What we need is to restore our sense of community. The welfare state must now operate in a more diverse and fragmented society, but it doesn't have to. We don't have to accept a diverse, fragmented society. we are spending too much time pitting one part of the society against the other. We don't need to do that. A skeptical, sometimes hostile media environment doesn't help. And maybe we need to start with the media and recognize that generating headlines is not necessarily the be-all and end-all of news coverage. There are questions about who deserves help and whether universalism can survive politically. I think it can, but it's a matter of encouraging the right questions in the right way. The climate change and the digital transformations of the 21st century revolutions that Beveridge never envisaged are something of a bigger challenge. Green jobs, reskilling, digital inclusion, and climate-induced displacement and migration. These are all issues that need to be addressed sensitively. And these are things which I think nobody could possibly have foreseen. These are not about the collapse of our social and political system. These are about new problems that need to be addressed. I'm not sure that Ed Miliband is addressing them. He's looking at solutions rather than the problem. We need somebody to address the problem. What do we do with the changes in our environment? And I think that the welfare state probably could survive, but we have to reimagine it, not merely defend the welfare state as it is. We have to go back to 1945, or indeed go back to the Beveridge report itself, and indeed those earlier liberal reforms, and say what were the principles guiding those reforms, and how do we reimagine them, and how do we apply them to today? In the same way as I believe that the 1951 Refugee Convention no longer works or no longer applies to the 21st century situation, so too the original implementation of the welfare state no longer works in our century. We need to go back to the principles and reimagine it. We don't need to abandon stuff. We just need to reimagine it and to make it work again. And we need to embrace universal services of education, health and childcare. That means if we actually get them right, we don't need private education. But at the moment, getting rid of private education doesn't improve state education. Getting rid of private medicine doesn't improve state medicine. Because we are not investing enough. And it's not only about investing, it's about rethinking how we do these things. So I've talked in the past a lot, rather too much, about the way that we can harness AI and harness technology to rethink our school and university teaching methodology. We should perhaps do the same thing with health. And possibly Wes Streeting is somebody who can comprehend that and deal with that. We need to innovate with flexible safety nets for insecure workers. We need to make sure that we're taxing capital and wealth more effectively and more fairly. Equality isn't necessarily the same as freedom, and it isn't necessarily the same as fairness. We need to rebuild the moral argument that prosperity is a shared achievement, not a solo triumph. And if that is done, the welfare state could rediscover the ethos of its shared destiny, not just its bureaucratic apparatus. Beveridge waged war on want, on disease and idleness, and today the giants wear different robes, but they remain, and we need to go back to the way that Beveridge tackled those giants of want, of disease, of ignorance, of squalor and idleness. Because the solutions today, I think, are different to the solutions that were advanced in 1942 and in 1945. That is the key to sorting out the welfare system, at least in my head. I'm not sure whether it works in practice. I would welcome your thoughts, but having been challenged, I can't resist a challenge.